Hey there, gang. It's time for an electric resonator guitar. This is a National. It's a Resolectric. I did a pickup swap in this one not too long ago, and I remember thinking it was a pretty cool guitar. The owner uses this for slide, as you might imagine. He likes a higher action, but the one thing he'd change is the fretboard, because he's used to playing those old school flatboard resonators. In other words, the fingerboard has no radius to it, not unlike a lot of classical guitars. It's a point of preference. There are slide players who mostly do single or double string work, and having a radius there lets you isolate a string or pair of strings in much the same way that a violin family instrument works, where they tip the bow inwards and outwards to catch the string they need. They do the same thing with a slide. Other people want a flat plane for the strings, so they don't have to press down to make a bunch of them sound at the same time. They'll do a lot of chording work, or maybe they're just really good at damping the strings they don't need behind the slide, but they want it flat. This player falls into that latter category, so we're going to do what might be considered major surgery. I'm going to yank the frets, I'm going to flatten this board, and then I'll refret it. There's one little challenge, and that is these diamond pearl inlays. Those will need to come out before flattening because I'd sand right through them. They're not thick enough to withstand a flattening of the board. So I'll take those out and they're going to go back in again. A cool headstock. I'm going to remove the truss rod cover here. I'll have to take off the nut, obviously. Just going to do a gentle score line around the nut here. National nuts tend not to be painted in, obviously, with this pearloid headstock. National nuts always have this really, I don't know, I'm not going to call it idiosyncratic, but it's very much their own profile. They tend to taper pretty quickly towards the top. Slightly more sharp and angular looking. They've been that way since the 20s. I'll tap that out. It's nice. They did it right. Make that very light scoring line on either side of each fret. This is to help prevent tear out of the fingerboard when it's time to remove them. There are barbs on the tang which can sort of propagate cracks that tend to run out into the surface of the fretboard beyond the edge of the fret. Having this score line there, it tends to stop them. If there's any splitting that occurs, it happens on that side of the score line. I got some new fret pullers. I'm going to give these a try. These are from 3 Peaks, made in Japan, and I bought them through Solo Guitars here in Canada. Just want to give them a shot. I've been using the same set that I made myself for like 15 years now. Firm Grip, made in Canada. The geometry is a little funny. It's always been a little bit off on the end. I've learned to work through it, but maybe it's time to change. I'm just going along and softening all of the inner edges if I can, because in my experience, if there's a way for fret pliers to pinch the soft inner flesh of your palm, they'll find a way to do it. Those of you who've been following for any length of time will know the drill. I start out by heating the fret up with an old soldering iron to soften any glue that was used during installation. It feels like there might be a little bit of glue at the ends of these frets. This is an ideal subject, actually, to try out the new removal tool because I don't have to be too precious about the surface of this board because it's all going to get sanded away. I still want to be cautious though, obviously. I give the frets a little wiggle every now and then to shake the fret barbs loose from the places where they've seated themselves, but I try not to exert any real lifting force. It should all be focused on the wedging action of the nipper's jaws. So once I get it started on one side of the board, I slowly work my way across, millimeter by millimeter, incrementally. I'm not grabbing hold and yanking up in one fell swoop. by moving slowly, it helps to support the wood around the area that's lifting and minimize the chip out. Sometimes it helps to work on the ends first, as those tend to be the most prone to chipping. These new nippers seem to work as well as my old homemade ones, so they're going to go into everyday service. I like them. At the end of the fret slots, you can see a little torn grain there that actually has the color of raw hamburger. This was surprising, because this board isn't rosewood. It seems to have been dyed, probably during that period when U.S. manufacturers were being raided, when all the rosewoods were put on the CITES treaty list, and you needed strict documentation about sourcing. Everyone went scrambling, trying to come up with alternatives. So I think this may have been either Red Heart or Paduke. Good hard woods with properties we like for fingerboards, but they are startlingly red. Second here and measure this wire. It is, looks like it's around 104 thousandths wide. And this is a difficult way of measuring it, but somewhere in the range of 45 thousandths tall. So this isn't like a modern jumbo wire. It's one step down. It's sort of like a vintage Gibson jumbo. And as luck would have it, I've got a stack of this on hand, so I've got a direct replacement, which is nice. Having a look at this triangular inlay here, which is located very conveniently for us adjacent to the nut, so we can see just how thick it is. And it seems to be around 50 thousandths of an inch, 1.2 millimeters, which is very typical for this kind of pearl work. The radius on the fingerboard is not extreme. It's not like a vintage Fender or anything. It's around 14 inches, which is not quite a Martin. It's flatter than a Gibson. But even with that, if I was to level it from side to side, we would lose probably 9/10 of the thickness of that pearl inlay. It would be paper thin, and odds are we would sand through in some places. So we're going to have to take these out. There's no way around it. Removal will have to be done with heat, and I'm going to start by scribing a line around the border of each inlay. This will help get a little steam in there to soften things, and also make it easier to access when I want to pry them up. This job has become a little more difficult with the adoption of CNC router technology in the last 20 years. The parts these days now fit together so tightly that it's hard to get a blade in between them. In the past, there would have been a thin line of filler around each inlay. When I put these back, their pockets will be wider by the thickness of the knife cut, so they'll look more like something you'd find on a 1960s guitar, which I think is okay. Using my sealing iron here, it's set to medium-low. I really do need to warm up the rosewood because these were probably installed with epoxy or super glue. The pearl itself is a very brittle material. It won't be affected by the heat. If these were plastic inlays, I'd have to be much more careful because those could discolor or melt. I've also put a little water in there too for some steam. Not so much for the glue. Those are pretty impervious to water, but it softens the wood a little so that when I pry against it with a chisel here, it has some resiliency. It's going to bounce back rather than crush. That can lead to cleaner results. Being very careful here because they're quite delicate, and the points, of course, are just looking for any excuse to break off. Round dots are much stronger and they're easier to pull up. I'll mark one point of each diamond so I know where it goes back later on. You can see the adhesive on the bottom here is pretty glass-like. It's very crispy. They used some very pretty maple for the neck. I'll start off removing the bulk of the waste with a hand plane. This is very sharp. You have to be careful because you're butting into each of those fret slots. So it needs to be a very sharp, very fine cut. This is a junior jack plane, which is I think around 12.5 inches long. A slightly larger plane might be better, but this is the longest I have, and I also know I'm going to be sanding it flat again using a leveling beam. Things are starting to get pretty red. I start off with a fairly coarse grit. This is an 80 grit sanding block, just to knock off more of the waste material. I'll work up to 220 grit on my level. I'll know I'm getting close by observing the character of the fret slots. Okay, so I got the board sanded flat and up to about 220 grit paper, with the expectation that I'm going to do one more level sanding after I've reinstalled these, so they're blending with the surface. As you can see, the center diamonds in particular are quite shallow now after that sanding, just over 0.010 of an inch. So we got rid of almost a millimeter in the center of the board. These are kept on a piece of tape here so I don't lose their positions, and they're numbered because I want them to go back in the same orientation as they were before. It's important to check that the board is level not only from end to end but also from corner to corner to make sure there isn't any twist developing. And of course we want it flat across its width as well. I'll check the thickness of each individual inlay as I go along here because they could vary depending on how much they were sanded after they were installed. These varied by about 0.005 of an inch. So I set my router using feeler gauges and excavated a pocket for this first diamond up by the nut. I'll clean out the corners and the point using a small chisel. To give my tiny router bit and the bearings in my rotary tool a break, I excavate most of the waste first. This wood carves pretty cleanly. Wasn't really striving for a perfect surface though. And you can see I've only got a couple of thousandths of an inch that I have to take away with the router burr. I start in the center and work my way out to the corners. You can see that doing all this requires a considerable investment in time. You can tack on a couple of hours to any fret job where it's required, and larger inlays increase the difficulty. It's time to reinstall, and I'm using gel viscosity super glue. It gives me a little extra working time, and it acts to fill any gaps between the pearl and the wood. I do my best to get the surface level, but you have to remember that these were originally sanded to a radius, so the tops aren't perfectly flat. And this is why I left a little extra material on the fingerboard. Before I do that final leveling though, I'll fill in any gaps around the outline in the diamonds using some sanding dust and some thin viscosity super glue. This should be pretty light because I took pains to keep the board level previously. I'll clean out the fret slots. Now this is a very light coat of oil. Not enough to get down in the slots, but enough to provide sort of a resist against the glue I'll be using. Look at that red stripe. I talked to the customer and he wants me to leave the natural color of the wood. There's one little area here that needs some attention, a little tiny chip. Put a piece of plastic in the fret slot to act as a dam, then a drop of accelerator. Then I'll put on just a touch of sanding dust of the appropriate color. Pack that in there. A little super glue on top. I'll let that dry. I'll level it carefully with the razor blade and sand it. I can re-oil it and it'll virtually disappear. I'll set the depth on my slotting saw to just below the tang on these frets. It shouldn't take much to clean out the slots. I don't really need to make them deeper because I only sanded to the outside depth of the radius. I didn't reduce the thickness of the board on its edge, so these things should be about the right depth anyway. There we are. I prepare each fret by cutting it to length. I've also put a slight radius on the wire. I buy the wire in straight 24-inch or 60-centimeter lengths. And even though this is a flat board, I like a radius on there because it pushes the fret barb sideways just a little bit when it's being installed. And I think that makes for a stronger connection. And here's a tip. if you're using this 24-inch wire, cut only about 9 frets out of your first length of wire, and then switch over to cutting the next length. You can go back and finish off at the end. If you go all the way to the end on the first wire, you wind up with a piece that is just a little bit too short. And if you do this, you'll get an extra fret out of it this way, and possibly save cutting into a third wire, depending on the width of your fretboard. I know that seems like a ridiculous frugality, but if you do it enough times, maybe this year both children can have a Christmas present. I'm nipping the tang at the end of each fret. Again, this is sort of for a premium job. The extra effort means that the ends of the frets will never sprout out past the fingerboard. The nipper always leaves a little bit of tang that I have to clean up by hand using a file. Apparently Stuart McDonald is coming out with some whiz-bang new device that will make this unnecessary. Should be nice. Although this is kind of contemplative. This is sort of meditation work. It's always good practice to lightly chamfer the corners of the fret slots. It helps the frets go in easily, and it reduces the chance of damage if they ever have to come out again. It's the usual thing for the frets. Putting a little fish glue in the slots. Using the hammer this time rather than the Jaws fret press. The straight board. Just as easy. Clean off most of the excess glue here. Some more will almost invariably come out later on. It cleans up easily. Also make sure I get the ends of the frets so there isn't glue dripping down the side of the neck. And move on to the next one. I'll clip the ends. I'll bevel the edges of the frets using a file holder. I'll fill the ends of the fret slots with some dust and glue. Seems like an awful lot of leveling on this job. Not much had to come off the frets though. Crowning with my new 3-corner files. These things are working out pretty well. Polishing with micro mesh pads. Such brightness, such gleam. Take care of the sharp ends. I'll oil the board again. Heavier coat this time. You quickly learn that setting up a Resonator guitar takes a little extra time. There's a bunch of mechanical stuff that has to take place. Removing the cover, putting the strings on, setting it up, taking the strings off, putting the cover back on, checking your work. So I tend to do most of the setup with the cover off. That way I have access to the bridge biscuit here. Reinstall the tailpiece, put the strings in place. I'll be using some flat tops. These are sort of a hybrid. It's like a round wound string where the top is ground level, so it's not really a flat wound, but it kind of feels like one. I have to work on the nut and the bridge to make sure that the strings now conform to the new profile of the fingerboard. Should be flat in both cases. So the middle 4 strings have to kind of come down a little bit. This is a delicate operation. You don't want to put too much pressure on the cone, so go slow and easy. After adjusting the slots in the nut, a little bit of material had to come off the top in the center. Once again, it's going to be kind of flat. And we're all done for today. I'm happy with it. This thing is strung in G minor, I think, which is not a tuning I work with very often, so you'll forgive me. This has got a Highlander Resonator pickup in the bridge and a Mojo Tone noiseless P90 for the neck, which is a pickup I really enjoy.